Keith Locke.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like, on behalf of the Green Party, to endorse the comments of John Hayes and Chris Carter on this matter, and the Foreign Affairs, Defence and Trade Select Committee that considered the briefing from the Baha'i community worked quite well and came to consensus conclusions. Many MPs around the country will have been lobbied by members of the Baha'i community. They're a very active community, very strong in defending the rights of their co-religionists in Iran. The Baha'i faith is quite strong in Iran. In terms of the total Iranian population, it's not large, about 350,000 people, but I think it is the largest religious minority. And as John Hayes pointed out, it has a particular problem because it came out of Islam, and its members are considered by some of the more extreme orthodox Islamic leaders as heretics and don't accept the Baha'i faith as a religion, instead define it as a political movement. And the Baha'i people suffer discrimination, not just informal discrimination, but systematic discrimination in the workforce, in education, getting places in the education system, and in certain social services provided by the state. And we were told that there's about 220 Baha'i imprisoned in Iran, including 7 of their leaders called the Yaran. 7 top leaders have been imprisoned there for over a year. There's been a particular international campaign to get them freed. The charge against them is quite extreme. They include, quote, espionage for Israel, insulting religious sanctities, and propaganda against the Islamic Republic, end quote. And these charges carry the death penalty. Even one of their lawyers has suffered. He was imprisoned for quite a while in the aftermath of the big protests that took place in Iran following the June presidential elections, the disputed presidential elections in Iran. That lawyer, Abdul Fattah Sultani, has now been released. But the 7 Baha'i leaders are still in jail. As John Hayes and Chris Carter have indicated, we advocated that the New Zealand continue to take up the case of Baha'is at bilateral meetings with the Iranian government and in the United Nations, where there are regularly motions put up, particularly by the Canadian government. And post our report coming out, the meeting that John Hayes talked about to take place in November, what I think it's called the 3rd Committee of the UN General Assembly, it did actually discuss a motion and did actually pass a motion expressing deep concern at serious, ongoing and recurring human rights violations in Iran. And it talked about, and it urged the Islamic Republic to end harassment and intimidation and persecution of political opponents, and pointed out that 5 people have actually been sentenced to death in the aftermath of the protests, I don't know whether any of the actual protesters have been executed yet, but a lot of executions do go on in Iran. It executes large numbers of criminals each year. It's one of the leading countries, unfortunately, for executions. The motion that the UN carried also talked about what are called increasing discrimination against persons belonging to religious and ethnic minorities, and some of the ethnic minorities are Arabs, Kurds and Azaris. I disagree a bit with Chris Carter that the Baha'i are the only religion persecuted. In fact, some of the other religions, such as the Christians, are persecuted to a lesser degree than Baha'i, sure, but it has been a factor. It has been a factor in some of the refugee cases in New Zealand about whether Christian converts from Islam going back to Iran could suffer persecution, and a motion has been passed in the first reading in the Iranian parliament to determine apostates, that is people who have converted from Islam to Christianity, could be subject to the death penalty. That that hasn't gone past the first reading in the Iranian Parliament yet, but it just shows that there is a prejudice and persecution against more than Baha'i, although, that being said, Baha'i are the main targets. The other thing the motion at the UN in November pushed for was the right of UN inspectors to have a look at the human rights situation, but that request has been turned down, as it has been for several years. Now, the whole question of Baha'i, of course, is relevant to the general opposition and growing opposition to essentially authoritarian rule and rule from a grand leader, the Islamic leader Khomeini. And those demonstrations are still continuing, you know, and this Parliament, about 6 months ago, after these demonstrations took place and there was persecution of those demonstrating, did actually endorse unanimously a motion I put up into this Parliament to, you know, actually convey to the Iranian authorities the concern of this Parliament. That was very good. We moved that motion. But since then, the situation hasn't really improved. Human Rights Watch put out a report on November the 11th talking about credible, verified reports of torture, rape and ill treatment in detention, show trials without due process, thousands of people arbitrarily arrested and disappeared, held incommunicado, journalists, human rights defenders, students and other groups have been targeted, and people have been beaten and shot in protest. Not a very good record at all. And then just recently, just over the last few days, in fact, protests have re-erupted, led by students in the main from their university bases, particularly in Tehran, but also other cities. And they actually had coordinated demonstrations across the country on December 8th to mark the anniversary of the killing of 3 students by security forces back in 1953. And I think the fact that they go back there is quite interesting, because since 1953, either they've had to suffer under the pressure after the overthrow of Mohammad Mossadegh, who was the first real democratic elected leader of Iran, who was overthrown essentially by the American Central Intelligence Agency. There's a lot of history and documentation of that. That then the Shah ruled that country with an iron hand and tortured people, executed people, refused to have any opposition. And then, of course, under the Islamic Republic, there has been repression as well. So the students going back to mark that particular series of protests back in 1953. But the revolutionary guards who serve the regime, plus the military, have surrounded campuses over the last few days and prevented the students getting out to join others in the community on protest. They've even gone to the extreme lengths over the last couple of days to shut down the whole mobile phone network and the internet to stop these students and other protesters communicating with each other. So, you know, we've got very brave people in Iran, despite all this repression, who are standing up, who are demonstrating, knowing they could be arrested, could be killed, could be tortured, etc. So I think it is very relevant we're having this discussion tonight and supporting the report of the Select Committee. Thank you.